Hello, viewers. I thought I'd try something new, kind of an interactive style with the videos. I'm just still waiting for Guadalcanal to open back up for tourists, and hopefully I'll get there by the end of this year, if not by next year. And then I can start filming on scene again, which is what I really want to do. But in the meantime, I thought I'd give you these small videos, and even though I'm not on scene filming, it fills a lot of the gaps. And the one I'll do now is called the Goettche Patrol, or Goettche Patrol, as some people called it. A lot of viewers want to see this one, and it's a very popular subject in relation to the Guadalcanal campaign. So this is my first style using this method, or sorry, the first time I first used this method. So let's just see how we go. If I don't really mess this up too bad, we might do some live feeds, and then you can actually ask me some questions. And in the meantime, when you go on my site, just if you got any recommendations you want me to speak about, and some of you guys put some good ones in there, just let me know. So just bear with me through this. My first time, but it's not my first time presenting, but the first time using this high technical data, I guess you could say. So let's see how we go, huh? So what you'll see here is the Goettche Patrol, or Goettche Patrol. Now, you won't see my face the whole time. I'll pop off these slides, so you know, see my ugly mug popping up here is what they say in Australia. So the Goettche Patrol, you notice I put the Marines' blood vendetta, and I'll describe in detail what that is a bit later, and why I think that, and why other people actually think this, and why it's a very important part of the Guadalcanal campaign, and also in the Pacific War in general. So I'll get my face off here, and we'll go straight to the main stuff, huh? So the Goettche Patrol, some people pronounce it a different way. I'll just pronounce it Goettche, or Goettche. That's what I've heard some of the Marine veterans call it, the Goettche Patrol. Some people say Goettche, but I'll just call it Goettche Patrol throughout this. So the Goettche Patrol, let me just go to the next slide. It's centered around a fellow by the name of Colonel Frank Goettche. Now, Colonel Goettche was the D2, or the intelligence officer for the division, the 1st Marine Division. He was Lieutenant Colonel. He was appointed in 41. A little bit of background behind Goettche. He started out as an enlisted Marine during the Great War, and he was commissioned as an officer. And he arrived in his unit on the 11th of November, 1918. So those of you guys that know about the Great War, War I, that was the end date, so to speak. So he missed out on the fighting. He participated in the occupation of Germany. And then throughout the interwars, he did what you could say a typical Marine officer's role was. He did some time, I think, in Nicaragua, definitely Haiti, China, and shipboard detachments, and a few staff positions. He was also a very famous football player. In fact, I think he turned down an NFL contract with the New York Giants to remain in the Marine Corps. He's a pretty big fella, very popular fella with his troops. So in 1942, when he was with the D2, or the head intelligence officer of the 1st Marine Division, and once they've got the green light to invade Tulagi and the nearby island of Guadalcanal, you can imagine him and his staff was scrambling around for any intelligence on the forces they might face on the island. So he flew to New Zealand and Australia a number of times with his staff members, trying to gather intel as best they can from former officials and planters and people who actually lived in the Solomon Islands. So his intel reports basically said there was roughly 3,000 Japanese on Guadalcanal, and a large part of that was combat troops consisting of an infantry regiment, which in reality it was just a security force company, some anti-aircraft units, and a few thousand labor troops trying to build that airfield. So the Marines landed without a shot being fired on them at Guadalcanal on Beach Red on the 7th of August. It was a bit of a letdown for a Goettche, not so much that he didn't get shot at, but his intel was quite off. So he found himself after the first week trying to scramble around and gather more intel on the existing Japanese, because they knew there were a few thousand on the island. So where did they go to? So that was what him and his staff was trying to locate. You see this photograph on the left here, and that's Goettge with a paymaster, the Japanese pay chest, you could say. Interesting point about this Japanese, when the Marines first landed there, the Japanese thought it was a raid. So they moved out very quickly, and they opened up safes, and they opened up quite a few things, just thinking hopefully that the Marines would land and be out in a day or two and they could reoccupy, but that was not the way it was. The Marines actually landed and stayed. So the Japanese, a lot of these guys were the Korean labor troops. They moved further to the west around the Guadalcanal River and in the jungles itself. So in the first week, they found themselves there. Now, just like I mentioned before, Goettge was trying to get some intel. They knew these Japanese went somewhere. So here you see a Google map of modern day Solomon Islands at Honiara, which is the area which is called today, which is the capital of the Solomon Islands. I'll put a few pin drops in there just to orientate you. So if you look to the right, you got Henderson Field. So that's the Honiara International Airport today, which occupies the side of the war Henderson Airfield as we know it. So the Marines had that perimeter there. You'll see the next pin is the Kukum Boat Basin. Now, the Kukum Boat Basin, Kukum was a small village pre-war because all this was coconut plantations. And the Kukum Boat Basin was the area that the Japanese built their docks on to start to offload all their equipment to build that airfield. So they had a little bit of a base station there. So a lot of these photos you see of Guadalcanal when the Marines went in, it showed the Japanese ice factory. It had one said Tojo Ice Factory. That was a famous photo of the Marines standing in front of it, and a few Japanese buildings. A lot of that was located around this Kukum Boat Basin. So after the Marines established a perimeter there, so the U.S. Coast Guard, which operated the landing craft, and some of the U.S. Navy guys actually used that as their boat basin. So they had some of the small landing craft in their boat basin. And the 5th Marine Regiment was extended about roughly a kilometer to the west in the perimeter there. So let me go to the next slide. Oh, here's a good slide here. This is some of the Japanese POWs. And you'll see any time, especially during the war, that the Guadalcanal POWs, they said there's all Japanese. But the majority of these guys were Korean laborers. And you can see the things that give them away. There are some Japanese naval guys there because they got the caps with the little anchors on them. But the ones with the round caps, the giggle caps, they call them in Australia, the beach caps or the boonie hats, as we used to call them when I was in the Marines, they're generally your Korean laborers. So there was a bunch of those guys running around. And the Marines actually used them later for their own labor needs, especially burying the dead Japanese in some of these big battles. So there was a lot of these guys running around. And the intel was saying that these guys was concentrated west of the Guadalcanal. So I'll go back to the preceding slide. And you've got that little joint. I've got a lot of maps later I'll show you, but there's a little bit which is Goettge Patrol pin. To the left of that, it's a little peninsula that extends out. That's Point Cruz. And let me just see. Here we go. All right, this area is proposed landing site. So this is the area left or west of Point Cruz the Japanese were supposed to be concentrating some of these Japanese labor troops, and they were willing to surrender. The intel was saying these guys here. Now, the Marines had a first sergeant called First Sergeant Custer. It's pretty, wouldn't say it's a good or bad last name, but, I guess you'll see later. But Custer, yes, he was related, far distance cousin to the famous George Armstrong Custer, the Custer's Last Stand, the American Indian Wars. But Custer was a career Marine. I've got a photo of him. Like I said, this is my first time doing this, guys, so bear with me here. Yeah, some cool photos coming up, huh? So Custer's the guy to the right. So he's the first sergeant. He was the head enlisted guy of the whole division intel section. So Custer was an old breed Marine, as they call it. He's been around for a number of years. First sergeant. He's the guy on the right-hand side there. So Custer, to gather more intel, he was getting together a combat patrol, a large combat patrol, and he was going to venture further west of the Guadalcanal and see if he could find this concentration of where these Japanese had went. So that's Custer on the right. I'll explain who the other fellow is a bit later. All right. So the Marines had on the perimeter, they had a Japanese that they actually located. And he was a warrant officer, and his name was, I'm sorry if I mispronounce this Japanese, but Sakedo. There's been different reports. I've heard he's referred to as the Japanese Special Naval Landing Force, or sometimes people call them Japanese Marines, or he was a Japanese sailor. Either way, he was a warrant officer, and he was in the naval forces. So he had actually surrendered. So they brought him in, because at that stage, they didn't have any real live Japanese prisoners they could interrogate. So he was a pretty surly fellow, as you can imagine. If you remember, a lot of these Japanese didn't have any training about once they got captured, because they was never trained to be captured, the resistance to interrogation, because a lot of them basically spilled their guts, so to speak, and they didn't know not to say anything. So this guy was a bit of a hard case. So the Marines used some very special torture techniques, you could say. They just filled him full of whiskey and got him talking. So loose lips. So he basically said words to the effect that, hey, there's a large group of Japanese west of Guadalcanal, mainly laborers. They're starving. They'll surrender. They're just looking for someone to surrender. And also, a day before, the Marines had received reports of around the Guadalcanal River. You'll see here Guadalcanal village. I'll explain in a minute. Guadalcanal River is the river to the right. The Guadalcanal River, there was some surrender flags, white flag from a pole. Who's to know what that exactly was? It was probably just the Japanese, normal Japanese flag, and it wasn't blowing in the breeze. It was probably down, and it was hiding the red and insignia in the middle, and only showing the white bit. So that's probably, they thought it might be a surrender flag. Anyway, with this intelligence, Goettge actually heard this in interrogation, and he thought, well, this would be a good chance for me to redeem myself a bit, kill a few birds with one stone. I'll get this prisoner, and he'll take me to all these Japanese further west of the Guadalcanal and west of Point Cruz. They'll surrender to me, and then, without firing a shot, and the majority of the Japanese on this island will be surrendered, and we don't have to worry about them anymore. So First Sergeant Custer's patrol was taken over by Colonel Goettge. So Colonel Goettge was basically going to lead the patrol. And before First Sergeant Custer had a number of combat Marines in there and some good scouts. So the colonel replaced them with a lot of intelligence specialists from the 5th Marine Regiment. Basically took everyone except for 2 members out of their intelligence section, and a few members from the division intelligence section. And so we replaced these combat. So it went from being a combat patrol to more like a humanitarian patrol. They didn't have any heavy weapons, no radios. A lot of these guys, even though they're trained Marines, they wouldn't combat units like infantry units, so to speak. They're very specialist top men. Now, goes back to this guy here. Once again, I'll try to get my stuff together for the next slide. Guy on the right's Custer. Guy on the left, Lieutenant Corey. I will mention him. He was one of the guys that was put into this patrol. He was a lieutenant. He's an interesting fellow pre-war. He lived in Japan. He could speak, and he was one of the few guys in the whole division who could speak and write Japanese fluently. One of the most, interesting things about Corey, he was involved in code breaking at the beginning of the war. And I think some of you viewers know about how the Americans broke the Japanese code. It was called magic. That was their code word for it. And obviously, if you've read about Midway, you'll know how we broke their codes. Well, Corey knew about this. You can imagine the repercussions and the risk by putting this guy on a combat patrol, the risk of him getting captured and sort of telling the Japanese about the U.S. and Americans had broken the code. So it's a big what if. Few people even knew he had that ability or he had that knowledge, but he shouldn't have been on that patrol in the beginning. So it's only, I think, later after the war that this information was released. So I don't even think the division commander even knew. So we'll go back to the slide here. All right, so the plan was Goettge and his 25 Marines, including him, and this Japanese warrant officer, and he was going to guide them in. So what they were going to do, they're going to leave about midday. All right, it was only going to like a day trip, and they were going to get in a tank lighter, which was like a large landing craft. They were going to leave the Cook Boat Basin. They were going to proceed to the west of Point Cruz, which is here, proposed landing site to the left. Now, this photo was taken 18 August 1942, which is a number of days after the Goettche Patrol. The Goettche Patrol was the 12th of August. So this is an aerial reconnaissance. So in this photo here, Goettche and his rest of his guys are actually in this photo. And I'll explain a bit later why I'm saying that. This is a blow up in Matanical village. They had a local name to the village, and it starts with an H. I can't pronounce it, but it was known as to the Marines as Matanical village. Just a small cluster of villages. Now you'll notice up top there was a coastal track, and it went basically for the plantations. It crossed the mouth of the Matanical River on the sandbar. It came back in, and it went through the village, and you'll see it going off to the left there. So that was the coastal track, or the government trail, they called it. All right. So this is just a mud map written or drew from PacificRex.com. Good site, by the way, by a veteran of the battle, or the veteran that went through there later. All right. So on the evening of the 12th, on the midday of the 12th, this patrol was supposed to leave, and they had to kept replacing members of the patrol with the intelligence specialists. And by the time they started leaving on the 12th, it was getting around 1800 or nightfall. And you ever been to Guadalcanal? Around 6 in the morning and 6 at night, it's so close to the equator. 1 minute is daylight, next minute is dark. It gets dark very quick there. It gets daylight very quick. But some of the senior NCOs in the unit was getting a bit frustrated. You know, they didn't really like the idea. And this guy here, Lieutenant Colonel Bill Whalen, should be a book written about this fellow. He was a real good patrol leader, as in Lieutenant Colonel. He was executive officer of the 5th Marine Regiment at the time. He later formed the Scouts and Snipers, and he used to lead many patrols by himself or take other Marines up with him. Expert shot, Olympic shot. I forget which Olympics he was in. Real outdoorsman. So Bill Whalen had led a number of patrols in the preceding days up in around that area, especially around Matanical mouth. And each patrol they went up there hit a bit of a hornet's nest. They had some fire, machine gun fire, and rifle fire, and mortar fire. And they withdrew quite quickly. So his intel, he told Goettche, he says, "Look, that's a real hornet's nest. I would stay away from the mouth of Matanical." Goettche said, "Yeah, okay, I hear you, but we're going west, far west of Matanical. We're not going nowhere near it." Now, the division commander, Major General Archer Vandergrift, he wasn't too keen on the idea either of Goettche leading this patrol. It was only him and the chief of staff, which was Thomas, could really order Goettche not to do it. So Vandergrift didn't order him not to do it, but he said, "Look, I'll leave it up to you, but I really don't wish you would do this." But, you know, Goettche took that as a green light to go. So he was set to go, leading 24 other Marines and this interpreter, or sorry, this Japanese prisoner they had. So I apologize for zooming through these very quickly. I'll try to stay on them a little bit so you can get a bit of a view of them. So they left Cook Boat Basin about 1800 or 6 p.m. on the 12th. They only got a short distance away when they seen what they deemed to be a flare or a fire from Cook Boat Basin. They took that as a signal, hey, you know, we need to return. So they turned around and went back to Cook Boat Basin. They got there. It wasn't for them, though. You know, I think it's been lost to history why it was either a flare or a fire they seen. But anyway, they said, okay, we'll continue on. So they left again probably around 8 o'clock. So they're heading to go to the west of the Matanical to land. All right. So basically what happened was around 2200, about 200 yards from the mouth of Matanical. I have another, if I see it here. Okay. So this is actually quite a good photo. This was in 2021. A guy called Nathan Bachman. He's the son of a friend of mine who actually lives on the island. He took a drone shot. This is how the area looks today. So you got a Mount Matanical there. Henderson's to the left, my arrow. Mount Austin's there to the top. So Goettge and the rest of them, they was proceeding in their tank lighter, and they were supposed to land way west, like I stated before. But I don't know if it was impatience or it was obviously it gets very dark there. They probably lost their bearings. So they started landing about 200 meters away from the Hornet's Nest, or the Mouth Matanical, as they were told. As soon as they started going in, the Japanese, the prisoners started yelling and carrying on and go, don't land here, because he knew what he was getting into. Before they could land, it hit a sandbar. Now, sand shifts over time. I've written here possible sandbar, so it's probably the approximate location they hit it. So it hit this sandbar. And as soon as they hit the sandbar, they got stuck on the sandbar. It took them about 20 minutes to get off. So they're rocking back and forth, making a whole lot of noise, alerting everyone and their brother, so to speak. And the Japanese that was manning this village, or manning the checkpoint, they had a few, I guess, foxholes and bunkers on the bank there. It was the security force company of the, let me think, the 11th construction. So the 11th and 13th construction units, it was built in the airfield. So they were a security company. So they wouldn't, demoralize laborers, or they were Japanese troops who were armed and ready for a fight. They've been fighting Marines patrols for the past few days. It was Lieutenant Shinda, hopefully I say that correctly. It was his platoon, reinforced platoon. So the Marines were there on the sandbar, 20 minutes, rocking back and forth. They finally got it off. They made all this noise. The Japanese, initially they thought, oh, it's just a U.S. Navy guys coming in and back and forth, making like they had a few raids before, shooting up the place, and they wasn't too concerned. But once they hit that sandbar and they were there for a while, they said, what's going on here? This is not normal behavior of the Americans. So they manned their positions. And then once they got free of the sandbar, Goettge and the rest of them moved forward. And I'll backtrack. I think this is when the Japanese prisoner, the one officer, really started carrying on, because he said, oh, don't land here, what's going on? I think I don't know if they punched him in the face, but they basically said the next word out of your mouth will be, we're going to shoot you in the head if you don't be quiet. But anyway, they proceeded on and they landed. This is a modern day photo, and the one to the top left is from the 18th of August. My friend Peter Flavin, he does then and now photos. He's just colorized this one. So you'll see the one below it's a now photo, and this approximately the area where they landed. So the Wesley Church, if you go to Honiara today, the Wesley Churches, that's the grounds they landed on. One of the reasons I didn't film during the actual, when I was on Guadalcanal, was this whole place is built up, as you can imagine. And I'll show you some photos in a minute. It's a shanty town and a squatter's town, and it's just, you don't really see much there. It's actually quite better doing it this way. So that's what it looked like during the time in that little inset, and the one below it's how it looks roughly a few years ago. So they landed there, all 25 of them and their Japanese prisoner. Middle of the night, this is about 10 o'clock at night when they landed and they finally hit the ground. You can see this, once again, this is how it looks today. They landed about 200 meters away from the mouth, and this is shifted over time from the sand. There's a lot of floods that come through the years there. So they landed roughly in that area. That area was all coconut plantations at the time. So they landed pitch dark black, or it's very black. They moved forward. All right. So once they landed, they established a position on the beach. Let me see. Oop. Sorry, guys. I'll speak about each one of these in a second. Oh, that's a bit of a blow up there for you. That shows the squatters village I was talking about, and the mouth of Matanical. Those are familiar with the Guadalcanal campaign. That mouth of Matanical was where the tanks attacked in October. So, yeah, it's a good view there. Some good drone footage. And if you go there visiting Guadalcanal today, Just advise, probably don't want to get in the ocean there by the mouth, because that is considered the public toilets for this village. And the women's bathing area, they call it, which is the toilet area. They kind of frown on you getting in there, which I wouldn't get in there anyway. So this little insert, my friend Peter did this one again. Still from Guadalcanal Diary, and I'll discuss that at the end. Guadalcanal Diary was a film made in 1943 in relation to this incident. So this is the actual landing spot, how it looks today. It's been built up, and you can see they've thrown some rocks and stuff over the years, probably a bit of a breakwater because of the eroding beach. But at the time, it was black sand, like the Guadalcanal beaches are majority of the time. This is roughly the area where they landed. Some Matanikau Sandbar there. Cookham Beach is where they started from, with the boat basin, and Lunga Point's to the far left. So you can see how they tracked through there and landed at night. So once they landed, and you can see in that little insert, they've got the Japanese prisoner there, and he's the guy standing up. They actually had a rope around his neck, apparently, to like a, I guess like a dog or something, like a dog leash, to keep him under control so he wouldn't run away. Obviously, they didn't trust him that much. You got to remember, this is before the Battle of Alligator Creek, where they know the Japanese wouldn't surrender, and the deception and the deceitfulness of the Japanese, which they thought the Japanese were very capable of. We'll talk about that a bit later. So, but they still didn't trust them. So they landed there. I can see a little rising gun. For those who know the weapons, there's a rising gun there, which is not the best weapon in the world. Didn't have a great reputation. Anyway, they landed with, once again, they had no packs on, no heavy weapons, no radio, and they landed. Now, once they landed, they thought, well, this is a bit too dark. So our plans about landing there, doing a reconnaissance, and walk away back, it's kind of, gone for the day. So what we'll do, we'll hit the beach, we'll find a good place to bivouac for the night, and then wait till daylight, and we'll proceed. So Goettge, Custer, and a captain named Ringer, who was the head of the 5th Marines Intelligence Section, moved forward, where the rest of them stayed on the beach. They moved forward into the jungle or into the palm trees, just a short distance, when one single shot went out. There's a couple of accounts about the Japanese prisoner. Some accounts say he was led up into the when these three Marines went up, they had the Japanese prisoner with them on a leash. I don't really go with that version. Another version had the Japanese prisoner remaining at the beach with the other Marines, and one of the Marine sergeants had a Reasing submachine gun to his head, so he wouldn't yell out. Because before, as you remember, when they were going to land, he started yelling and carrying on, and they said, "We're going to shoot you in the head if you don't be quiet." So I believe that version, because the 3 Marine would go forward. I wouldn't see them taking out Japanese with them. That would just hinder them a bit, because they were looking for a bivouac and to see exactly where they were at. So they went forward, and they heard a single shot ring out. And what that single shot did, he actually shot the colonel in the face. And then a machine gun started firing. And it's believed that Goettge died immediately. He was shot in the face, shot in the head, and he hit the ground. Custer was wounded, and Ringer was unwounded. So a few minutes later, Ringer and Custer come running out, and they said, the colonel's been shot. And at that stage, Captain Ringer and a couple of other Marines were going to go forward, including a guy called Frank Few, which is a platoon sergeant. And they were going to go to get the colonel. And then Frank Few and the other Marines told the captain to stay back. We've already lost one officer. We can't leave the other. You're in charge now. You need to stay back. So they went forward, and they found the colonel. And Frank Few said he found him, and he reached in, he felt his face, and obviously he'd been shot in the head, and he was dead. And he felt for his colonel insignias. He didn't want the Japanese to get him, so I think he took his dog tag off, and he definitely took his colonel insignias, his eagles, off his collar. And then he moved his way back. They ran in some Japanese and had a bit of a fight there, and ended up killing the Japanese. So what happened to the prisoner? Some accounts said the accounts that said he went forward with the 3 Marines initially, he died in the hell of gunfire. But the account I tend to believe is that he was remained on the beach, and one of the sergeants shot him. As soon as he heard shots, he immediately shot the Japanese in the head. And I tend to believe that one. So the Marines were pinned down under heavy fire. So let's see if I can get. So I don't know the origin of this, but this actually is the a sketch of the Marines on the beach. So they dug in as best they could. It's black sand. They didn't have any entrenching tools with them, and so they dug in with the helmets and probably bayonets, I imagine they had. And they dug in as best they could. They formed a perimeter, or formed a little beachhead, so to speak. Without having no radio, they fired a few tracer shots up in the air. And the Marines back at Cookham in the 5th Marine lines, they seen a few of the shots going up. They didn't know what that meant. They knew that the patrol had ran into some trouble, but it being pitch black dark, they weren't going to form a rescue at that stage. They didn't know if it was Goettche, because they knew it was coming from the mouth of Matanical, and they knew that the colonel and the rest of the guys was far away from the mouth of Matanical, so they wouldn't. They were very reluctant to send a full combat patrol at that stage. They was going to wait till daylight. So they didn't have any flares with them or anything. They just fired a few tracer rounds. So we talked about Corey and Custer. This is probably a good time to talk about this fella here. It's Lieutenant Commander Pratt. The only Navy person they had with him, or medical person they had with him, was this guy here. And he was the regimental surgeon of the 5th Marine Regiment. Now, Pratt has an interesting history on his own. So Pratt had earned a Navy Cross in the First World War with the 5th Marines in France at Bellewood. His brother was also a naval surgeon in the 5th Marines also. So him and his brother were both surgeons with the 5th Marines, Navy surgeons with the 5th Marines. So he earned a Navy Cross. So he's 52 years old. He's probably suffering from tuberculosis. He probably shouldn't have been on, well, he really shouldn't have been on Guadalcanal, but he did his part. You know, you gotta admire him for that. So he landed and he went forward. He thought, this is probably my last hurrah, so to speak, before, they catch up to me. He self-diagnosed tuberculosis, in fact, on himself. And he says, I won't probably get a chance to get in the front lines anymore. This will be it. That's why he jumped on and volunteered for the patrol. Just a side note, too, his son later died on Guadalcanal in January 1943 with the 6th Marine Regiment. He's a lieutenant. So he died leading a Marine rifle platoon. So yeah, so Pratt was with him at the time. So Pratt, that's a picture of him to the left, in the Great War, World War I uniform. So the Marines are pinned down. They tried to fire some tracers in there. How are we going to get, how are we going to get some help? So Captain Ringer asked one of the Marines, a guy called Arndt. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing his surname correctly. Monk Arndt. They call him, his nickname was Monk, because I think he was in Puerto Rico or something pre-war, and he used to climb the trees, and they called him a monkey. So they call him Monk. That was his nickname. Typical Marines give nicknames to everyone. So Mark was he was one of the, I guess, he was a scout, or an intelligent scout. So he had a bit of a knowledge and a little bit of capability to him. So he was volunteered, or I think he volunteered to go first to swim back. So he took off. And I'll go back to that one. Now you can see this is the beachhead, and he had to make it all the way back to Cookham Beach to the top left. So he took off on a full sprint to go down the beach, and then he hit the water, and the Japanese were shooting at him at the same time. So he took off. So his story, I encourage anyone to go read these guys' individual stories. I mean, he made it back. A bit of a spoiler, he did make it back, and he wrote his story and told his story, and it's a good story. My friend Jeff Rocker runs a great site called missingmarines.com, and he goes into detail about these guys, and I've got some photos from his site into my presentation, and he about each one of these, and he's listed the photos and a bit of a background behind each one, and he's written a book, and I've got the book too at the end. I'll show you. But he goes into detail about these guys and what happened to each one. So he made it back, and he landed. He got shot at a few times, and he was going into the ocean, back to the seas, cut himself up on coral. I think he stripped down completely, and he had his 45 in his helmet. He fired a few times at some Japanese. So he made it back to cook him about 5 o'clock in the morning, and he hit the beach yelling out million, million, million. He forgot the password, but he yelled out something that started with an L. Sorry, have to excuse me. I'm just drinking some water. So, and then the Marines luckily didn't shoot him and took him in. And that was at 5 o'clock in the morning now. This is still about 11 o'clock at night. So the Marines did form a rescue about 7, but like I said, this is not 11 o'clock at night. So Marines are still under heavy fire. They sent the first guy out, which was Arndt. They didn't know if he'd made it back or not after a few hours. Then they sent the next Marine called Bainbridge, Corporal Bainbridge. And Bainbridge went down the same path as Arndt. He ran straight down the beach. But unfortunately, Bainbridge didn't make it that far. You know, he only made it to the mouth of Tanacao before he was shot down and killed. So it was getting toward daylight. So the third Marine they sent out was a guy called Spalding. Spalding volunteered, but Spalding, instead of running down the beach, he jumped in the ocean to swim out. Once again, some of the Japanese trailed him. I think he landed at one stage, and he thought there was Marines on the beach, but the Japanese around the fire. Then I think they shot at him, and he jumped back in the water. But he made it back too, and to the perimeter. So there's 2 who's made it back to the perimeters, and there's 3 who's had a run for it, so to speak. So they still pinned down on the beach. So the guy on the left is Arndt. He was the guy that made it back. And the guy on the right is Frank Few. And I'll talk about Frank Few in a minute. Just another side note, Frank Few, he ended up living. He was only 3 of the survivors, and he got back. But Frank's grandfather or son, I've spoke to him. He lives in Australia also, because Frank married an Australian. Well, surprise, surprise, a Marine married an Australian girl. I only say that because I did the same thing. So yeah, he married an Australian. I think he lived in Australia for a little bit, and his wife moved. But anyway, he's got relatives. And I spoke to his grandson, who sent me some good photos. That's Frank Few, and I'll get to him in a second. So Marines are pinned down on the beach here at the landing site. It's getting daybreak. A lot of the Marines are dead by this stage. To get back to the Sergeant Pratt was working on First Sergeant Custer. Custer was bleeding out, so he was working him on the beach. He got shot once. Pratt did, I think, in the thigh, but he was hunched over Custer a bit later, and then the next rounds killed him, and on top of Custer. And then Custer succumbed to his injuries too. And then the Marines that were slowly getting picked off by the Japanese. So daybreak came. There was only, I think, 3 Marines left. And once again, you can go to some of these accounts. It goes into detail of which Marines there were. But I know the Captain Ringer was still left, Frank Few, and a couple of the other guys. So they knew there was no help coming to them. So they decided to all make a run for it. So they all took off running. I think 3 of them were shot down dead. And that just left Frank Few. So if you ever see the movie Guadalcanal Diary from 43, Frank Few's the last guy left. So Few, I'll get to Few here. That's him on the top right. Few knew that, hey, look, I'm about to die myself. There's no way I'm going to get out of here unless I jump in the ocean and start swimming. That's what Few did. He jumped in the ocean and started swimming out. He just had a pair of silk, liberated, I guess you could say, Japanese shorts on. Sorry, I'll get the bigger photo there. Yeah, so he had a pair of liberated Japanese shorts on, and he jumped in the ocean. The Japanese were firing at him. So he swam out quite a bit, and once again, he was getting cut by the coral, and he made his way back to the perimeter. And he actually made it back to the perimeter. In fact, when he hit the beach, there's a couple of Marines seen him walking up on the beach. And another picture of him here. They seen him walking up on the beach, and they were going to shoot him. The other says, "Oh, just that poor Japanese. He's not even armed. What's the go with him? Don't shoot him. He's no danger to us." Anyway, he got a bit closer, and they could recognize it was Frank Few, because Frank was another good combat soldier. He was a scout. He'd done a lot of working behind the lines, so to speak, doing a lot of forward scouting for the Marines up to that. In fact, him and I think Arndt had just returned back from an overnight scouting mission when they were picked to go to do this. They were asleep, so they wasn't too impressed. They were thrown on this. So this is actually Frank Few a few days after the incident. So after he's returned back, so they're forming the. He led the rescue attempt a few days later for another attempt. This is it. I'm pretty sure with Peter and I were looking at this. This is the Cookham boat basin. That's what it looked like. So Cookham boat basin. All right. So now we have 22 dead Marines on the beach, and we have 3 Marines that's made it back. So the next morning about 07, they started getting their rescue attempt. The Marines did. So Alpha or A Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Marines, and some of the elements of the L Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines formed the rescue attempt. So they moved down the coastal track, and they pushed the Japanese out for the time being. And they did see some bodies and bits of bodies, but then the Japanese started coming back, and the Marines pulled back quickly. Let's see if I got another photo here. No, so the Marines pulled back quickly to form a better rescue attempt. They still didn't know when they landed. They still thought the rest of the guys were still west of the Point Cruz. They didn't know they were at the mouth of Matanical until these survivors started saying, "Look, they're at the mouth of Matanical." So they knew it was a bit of a hornet's nest. So they needed a good attempt to go in there. So on the 18th and 19th, 3 Marine companies decided to do a concentrated attack on Matanical village. So they moved up and did a concentrated attack on Matanical village. And then they did find, I guess you could say, no survivors, but they did find evidence of the Goettche Patrol. And I won't go into specific details of this patrol. Frank Few went with them. He helped guide them in, and Art Monk. Just to say that the Marines were shocked of what the Japanese had done to the Marine bodies. And here's one quote here from one of the sergeants from L35. He said, "The smell came first, a scent that most of us who were there can recall in an instant. What lay beneath the foliage was no longer human. Sticking out of the sand was a boot containing the foot of its owner. I scraped in the sand and uncovered another legging with the leg still in it. Some men began to retch, but most stood stock still in horrified silence. No one spoke," recalled Miller. "Not a word. Some things are better left unsaid." And this is from the book Leaving Mac Behind, The Lost Marines of Guadalcanal, which my friend Jeff wrote. It's a great book. It talks about the Goettche Patrol, but quite other missing Marines who are on Guadalcanal. So let's just say, without too much details, if you go into his book, there's a lot of details of how the Marines were found. Some of the Marines were found in half buried in some trenches. Now I'll go back to this slide here. Is made by a Marine from 3-5. It's a bit unclear, but there's some. You got the village there. Right in front of the village, there's some looks like lines with half completed lines on it, and they are the Japanese trenches. And what was supposed to happen, the Japanese reported from the Japanese survivors, they threw some of the bodies into those trenches and buried them. And some of the and apparently some of the Marines in 3-5 seen body parts sticking out from it. One of them said they identified Goettche's boot or his hand sticking out. So who knows? Now on that, through the years, the missing patrol, they're still considered missing. Bodies never been located. Now, when the Marines came through initially, they found Bainbridge's body on the river mouth. They buried him there. So he was the only one that's really been identified. So they took his dog tag and they buried him. You know, Gunner Russ, guy called a Marine gunner named Russ, and the other guys found him. They buried him there at the mouth of Matanical, near the sand pit. And they took his dog tag. So he was the only one that's really been identified since. His body's still missing to this day, but he was identified, the next day. Now, there's been a number of expeditions. I know of 2 to try to locate these guys in later years. And a good friend, retired Marine Colonel Joe Mueller, was involved in one of these expeditions, I think in the 80s. And Joe Mueller interviewed a lot of these veterans. He interviewed the 3 veterans that actually survived the patrol, then the guys in the other Marines who went through the village and seen the patrol days later. And I think he actually interviewed some of the Japanese that was there. So he had a good picture. He's probably the expert in the world on the Goettche Patrol. But they've tried to locate it. They didn't come up. They did come up with some bodies, but not mainly Japanese. They came up with. Then I think there was an American university a few years later that tried to look for these guys too with ground penetrator radar. But to this day, they haven't been discovered. Now, why is that? Because what's the reason? All right, there's probably. Let me see if I can. Here's some of the guys. Probably the main reason, or some of the main reasons, is flooding. They were buried near the beach, and they could have been washed out to sea through the years. Because even the time I was at Guadalcanal, I noticed a few good floods come through, and it'd wash a large portion of the beach, especially around the mouth of the river, be washed out to sea. You got to remember, Guadalcanal became a major logistical base, training base after the war. So as soon as the Marines and the Navy moved in there, they just concreted the whole place, bulldozed and concreted, and basically made a medium-sized U.S. city, which later became Honiara, the capital. And also, too, that area of the Matanical was the scene of probably the most intense fighting in the Guadalcanal campaign for 4 months. I mean, I know during the October battle there on the 23rd, there was over 6,000 Marine artillery rounds that landed in that area in a period of a few hours overnight. So that would just pulverize the area. I mean, one of the Marines who were World War I veterans said it looked like a World War I battlefield. Could you imagine any remains that was there? And plus the remains were a lot of them were cut up quite a bit. Here's some of the faces. And if you go to Jeff's Missing Marines site, you'll see he goes into detail. I think we got pictures of every one of them except for maybe 2 to 3. So hopefully we'll get some photos of those guys too. There's Goettche, Delano, Custer, Gaunt, Gelzer, and Kelly. There were a few sergeants and platoon sergeants on this. There were experienced patrols. Cowell, Lyons, and Pratt. There's the doctor again. Hopefully I'm pronouncing these right. Rat, Ringer, and Sadula. Or Rot. Sorry if I mispronounced that. That was the captain in the middle, Ringer. Stanfield, Stauffer, and Walter. And here's the list of the missing. And so there was 22 of them. You'll notice a colonel, captain, lieutenants, first sergeant, platoon sergeant, sergeant, corporal. So a lot of NCOs in there. That was Jeff's book called Leaving Mac Behind, The Lost Marines of Guadalcanal. Great book. I recommend that book to anyone, especially if they want to know anything about graves registration and how the battlefield was handled with the missing in the battlefield dead. Did a lot of research, Jeff. Good book. Now, the importance of the Goettche Patrol and how it had a legacy during the war. Now, the patrol survivor, like I said, Charles Monk, sums it up quite well here. Division's mood changed from that of a normal person to a silent, mean person. You got to remember, at the time, the Marines thought, the Japanese warrant officer, it was a deception. The Japanese are very sneaky. It was a flag of truce, it was a white surrender flag, and this Japanese warrant officer, it was a trap, and he lured the Marines into the trap. And then when they found the Marines' bodies were cut up and butchered and tortured. That's partially true, but as we know now, we can't verify 100%. But this I wouldn't say poor, but the Japanese warrant officer had no intention of deceiving the Marines. I don't think, especially his behavior when he found out they were actually landing at the Hornets' nest, and he knew they weren't supposed to be landing there, and his chance of survival was cut down quite a bit. And I think the white flag was just, like I mentioned earlier, it was just the Japanese flag. It was unfurled. It was just showing the white parts of it. So the Marines, the Goettche Patrol, if you read Eugene Zisle's great memoir of the war, he mentions it. He mentions it in his basic training, I think his infantry training, how they talk about this. I think it was a 43, 44. It was almost like remember the Alamo phase. This was the battle cry for some of the Marines. Don't take any Japanese prisoners. They're deceptive. They will trick you. And then, within 2 weeks later, you had the Battle of Alligator Creek, where they first seen how the Japanese will not surrender, and they would try to kill themselves and kill Marines. So between that and this patrol here, it kind of set the stage for the rest of the Pacific War, where the Marines basically didn't take many prisoners, especially the Marine combat troops, the frontline infantry guys. They were very reluctant to take prisoners. Not so much they were so bloodthirsty, it's just the fact it was a matter of survival, because they didn't trust the Japanese. The Japanese would try to kill them, and the Japanese didn't take surrender, didn't take prisoners either. Really, I think on Guadalcanal, I cannot find one instance where there was an American prisoner of war. There was some Americans captured by the Japanese, but they were either interrogated and then killed, or they were just captured just to try to demoralize the rest of the Marines, because typical one of the tactics the Japanese would tie a Marine to a tree or something and torture them, and the screams are supposed to demoralize the enemy. That was one of their tactics, but didn't demoralize the enemy. It kind of made them mad. So that's the legacy of the Goettche Patrol. Will they ever be found? Hopefully one day they will. So I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. I guess hopefully in the future I'll get my my skills on the technical side a bit better, so I'm not bouncing back and forth between the slides for you. So hopefully you've got something out of it. If you got any recommendations, like I said at the beginning, just put them in the comments, or you go to my Facebook site, Guadalcanal Walking the Battlefield the same, and then we can discuss it. Or if you got any questions about it, just please let me know. All right, so hope you enjoyed this, and I'll tend to look at the camera next time. Like I said, I'll get my act together, but I'm mainly in for the information, not the it's not I guess you could say for the entertainment, not with my ugly face here. All right, thanks for listening, and we'll see if we can talk later about another good subject. Thank you.